What does Michael know? Who told him? And what has Michael told the office in part 3 of our pilot analysis series of the Anti Strangling Task Force? Part 1 of our pilot analysis, we discussed how one of the 2 deaths in question was covered up by the police for investigation purposes. It appears as though no one is aware that Tom's death was part of a murder-suicide, or that there even was a second death at all, with that second death of course being our erased top salesperson. We also discussed how the media is left in the dark about the second death, and this is communicated to us via the story the intro sequence is telling us. That of course being the whiting out of the checkout number, we know 2 staff members checked out, but the printing press, which is symbolized by the photocopier, goes public with the story of only 1 death. Tom. We also touched on why the police withhold details from the public. As they're investigating, they will try to bait people, try and see if anyone possesses intimate knowledge of the crime scene. It is a common police tactic, but withholding information is just one police tactic. Disseminating disinformation is another. We've all seen the movies where police will interview or interrogate their suspects, tell them that their partners have ratted them out, for example, just to get them to speak or just to see their reaction, right? Police tactics are vast when it comes to apprehending a suspect. Acknowledging this then, any information the police have released cannot be assumed to be the truth, but rather we need to assume that everybody is a suspect from the perspective of the police. Remember guys, it's day 1 after the bodies have been found. The police will say anything they need to say in order to progress their investigation. And lastly, we also need to keep in mind, if the police are withholding information, if they're investigating, if they're disseminating disinformation, it means the murder-suicide they've stumbled across is suspicious. The police are only going to investigate if there is something off. And this is what ultimately brings us to Michael. In part 2 of our pilot analysis, we covered how the pilot is Angela's first day because Angela replaced Tom as head of accounting. Now, simply through logical deduction, Michael had to have been the one to instigate the search for a new accountant. The hiring of staff cannot be done without Michael's knowledge and approval, nor is it within anybody else's authority to even start this process. Michael had to have been made aware that Tom would not be returning to the office, hence why the arrangements were made to hire Angela. But as we've also covered a number of times, Ryan was hired to cover for our erased salesperson. So Michael also knew his Top Gun wasn't going to arrive in the office that day as well. Now it stands to reason that Michael must have been informed by the police that 2 of his staff are not returning. So the first question we need to address is not so much what the police have told Michael, but why. Why did they tell Michael anything? Remember guys, it's day 1 of the police investigation. Tom and our salesperson died yesterday. Everybody is a suspect, including Michael. The police are going to try and bait and test him as much as anybody else. Whatever they have told him is not necessarily going to be the entire truth. So why tell him? Law enforcement operates on a need-to-know basis, and it's not in the sense that you would first assume. It's not about what Michael needs to know. It's about what the police need him to know. The only needs the police care about is apprehending the killer, their primary objective. So a different way that we can phrase this question isn't so much why did they tell him, but why did they need him to know? Now let's keep in mind 2 things here. Firstly, they're covering up the second death, the death of our erased top salesperson. This is likely an investigation tactic. And secondly, they are investigating because they are suspicious. I mean, as we covered in part 1 of our pilot analysis, we've had 3 deaths at Dunder Mifflin Scranton in a short period of time. At this stage in our investigation, we have to assume that the police suspect someone within the four walls of Dunder Mifflin Scranton. Now, this creates a problem for the police. Covering up the second death in order to test somebody's intimate knowledge of the crime scene, for example, doesn't work if everybody knows about the crime. It doesn't work if everybody knows our top salesperson is dead. The appearance of the victim being alive is crucial to bait any potential suspect, which means any employee absence must be explained believably so that the only people who know it's false is the murderers. And simply through logical deduction, a proper cover-up cannot be done unless Michael is able to explain those staff members' absences. In other words, Michael has to be the one to explain why these staff members are not going to be returning to work. But in much simpler terms, guys, law enforcement needs Michael's help. They need his help to cover up the second death. Now, this discussion between Michael and the police is what will set the tone for Michael's communications with the staff, with us, the viewer, the camera crew, and his love interests for the rest of the series. Michael is in a completely unique situation compared to anybody else in the office. And the reason for that is because the police have decided to bring him into the know somewhat. They are bringing Michael into the fold to some degree, and this requires an element of trust, but not a blind trust. Because they haven't cleared him as a suspect by this point in the series, Michael is going to be assessed on a different standard than everybody else in the office. They are going to monitor his cooperation, his willingness, see if he's trying to hide any evidence or aid and abet a possible accomplice. Every time we see Michael reveal another truth about the Scranton Strangler, it's not just to tell us, it's also to absolve himself. He wants to show to the police and to us that he is cooperating. So we can now start to understand why the police told him they need his help. But what exactly did they tell him? This part is pretty simple. What they told him is that there was a murder-suicide.
And Toby is the lazy detective who has decided that these armed robberies and rapes and murder-suicides are not important enough to solve. Well, you know what? I have a problem with that.
When we get to analyzing the episode Conflict Resolution, we're going to come to the realization that it was Michael who put this complaint into HR. And I know I'm jumping ahead here. Just to give you the simple logic, it had to be someone who knew about the crime but wouldn't risk prosecution by revealing that intimate knowledge to HR. And quite simply, as we've covered in this hypothesis so far, the only person who has been told by law enforcement is Michael. It simply had to be Michael. Now, the first question this raises is the legitimacy of the event. As we discussed at the beginning of this episode, police are not going to tell you the whole story, right? So the first thing that comes to our mind, well, was this really a murder-suicide? Now, considering that the police are suspicious, have gone to great lengths to cover up certain details of this crime, it has to be the case that the police don't really think it's a murder-suicide. The police most likely think they're dealing with a double homicide that has been framed as a murder-suicide. And moving forward, we are no longer going to refer to Tom and our salesperson's death as a murder-suicide, but rather we're going to refer to it as a double homicide. So let's just briefly for a moment recap where we are so far in this analysis. The police arrive to both crime scenes to what initially appears to them to be a murder-suicide. They find something that doesn't add up, and they are suspicious that they're really dealing with a double homicide. The police are aware of our death in the baler, they're now aware of Tom, and they're now aware of our top salesperson. They decide to cover up the salesperson's death from the public for investigation purposes, but they need Michael's help with the cover-up. They don't tell him what they really suspect, they tell him what they need him to know in order to assist them with the cover-up. Michael is called into the police station the same day, possibly to identify the bodies, definitively to be interviewed and interrogated, and likely prodded for an alibi as well. He agrees to cooperate with the police and offers them his full resources. They inform him that he needs to help them with the cover-up. Michael's task is to explain these two staff members' absences, and he needs to make it look like the police have not had a chat with Michael. So we now have an idea of why the police told Michael. We have an idea now of what they've told Michael. Well, what did Michael end up telling the office then? It has been speculated for years who leaked the downsizing rumor in the pilot episode. Guys, who do you think? Based on where we are in part 3 of our pilot analysis, who do you think leaked the downsizing rumor? It was Michael. Now, the method for the leak at this stage is hypothesized to be a forward like it's hot scenario. Michael possibly sends something accidentally down to packaging, right? And then they disseminate that information back upstairs into the office. Now, this is not a solid hypothesis regarding the method of the leak. The other thing I like to mention, guys, is this shot with Phyllis, then everybody else in the kitchen, and then Kevin and Angela is actually another example of another curse of 3 Scranton Strangler clue. You can clearly see we have those 3 shots, and as I've mentioned already on a number of episodes, any echo of the curse of 3 links back into the Scranton Strangler mystery. So in part 2 of our pilot analysis, we covered the last 2 shots. We hadn't yet addressed the first shot.
So what does downsizing actually mean?
Well,
this is the significance of the first shot. What does downsizing really mean? Let me tell you what downsizing means, guys. What downsizing means is 2 staff members got shot in the head, thrown over a bridge, and framed for a murder-suicide. That is what downsizing means. Now, if you've come this far in this episode, you're probably asking yourself, Detective Lloyd, it's an interesting story, but where's the evidence? Well, let me show you a couple of scenes that support this hypothesis in the pilot episode.
Any messages?
Yeah, just a fax.
Oh. Damn, this is from corporate. How many times have I told you that there's a special filing cabinet for things from corporate?
You haven't told
It's called the waste paper basket. Look at that. Oh, look at that face.
The first thing I want to point out is how Michael throws away Jan's memo. Why do you think he threw it away? Do you think he pretended not to read it? Part of Michael's story is likely that corporate downsized these 2 staff members and that they did it above his head. We can see in the scene when they're all in the conference room, they're all very worried that corporate is going to go above his head.
I know there's some rumors out there, and I just kind of want to set the record straight. Corporate has deemed it appropriate to enforce an ultimatum upon me. And Jan is thinking about downsizing either the Stanford branch or this branch.
Yeah, but Michael, what if they downsize here?
Not gonna happen.
It could be out of your hands, Michael.
It won't be out of my hands, Stanley, okay? I promise you that.
Oh, can you promise that?
Why? Because that's part of the leaked story. These 2 guys have left. I had nothing to do with it. Corporate came in today, said there's downsizing. Now, all of a sudden, people have lost faith in Michael. If corporate has downsized them, am I going to get downsized? Throwing away Jan's memo was in order to cover himself. To cover himself so the possible murderers in his office are not suspicious that Michael knows. And the reason the real murderers could be suspicious is because Michael wasn't in the office the day prior.
You just still have these messages from yesterday.
Relax, everything's under control.
So you can see here, Pam gives him his messages and she says these are yesterday's messages. The only thing I want to mention here, guys, for now, I'm only going to briefly touch on this. Pam gives Michael the fax first. She seems to wait half a day, then she gives him the messages. Pam is trying to bait Michael to see what he knows. Now, if you've seen 2 Scranton Stranglers, you'll know that Pam is currently our medium suspect, right? And the reason that episode had to be released prior to our pilot analysis is because Pam's actions in the pilot episode are highly suspicious. This wouldn't be the first time she's accused either of holding faxes and memos, and I'm not going to show you those examples, but here you have an explicit example where she decides at what pace she will release information to Michael. So the first element is Michael throwing away the fax. The second supporting piece of evidence is when Michael hires Ryan. Michael hires Ryan after Jan Jan's meeting. Had he hired Ryan prior to the meeting, it would be a giveaway that he knows. Instead, he waits until Jan says there's downsizing, and that gives him a believable reason to hire Ryan. The timing of his hiring is really important. Now also, just to briefly mention again, it's just our top salesperson's death that's covered up, right? It's just the guy that Ryan replaced. We don't have the same cover up with Tom, right? So we don't have to take the same precautions with Tom that we have to take with our top salesperson. Now I just want to touch again on the fact that Michael wasn't at work the day prior. And at this stage, the hypothesis is pretty straightforward. Michael was called into the police station, right? So he didn't take his messages yesterday. Why? Because Michael was getting informed of the whole situation. The conference room meeting also confirms that Michael leaked the rumor. We need to keep it simple sometimes in this investigation. The simple reality is there were only 3 people who knew about downsizing: Jan, Pam, and Michael, right? Jan was gone, so it really just comes down to Pam and Michael. But the point about bringing the conference room meeting up is ultimately the reaction of the staff when Pam says,
I was in the meeting with Jan, and she did say that it could be this branch that gets the axe.
Are you sure about that?
she also heard there might be downsizing. The staff clearly reacts surprised. If the rumor had been leaked from Pam, we'd probably expect a bit more of a, aha, Michael, you're lying sort of a moment, right? But it seems apparent to me it's news. It's new news to most of the staff in the conference room, right? It's the first they've heard of it coming from Pam. This now brings us to the deleted scenes of the episode.
All these people are walking around and they're happy and their lives are just going along and ignorance is bliss. But if they knew what was lurking on the other side of that fence, that furry monster, I'm gonna get you downsizing. No, they wouldn't. They'd freak. And I'm not going to play God.
He says they'd freak. Guys, he's not really talking about layoffs. You know what he's talking about. And remember, even if the camera crew don't know about the second death, it's irrelevant. Michael is not talking to the camera crew. Michael is talking to the camera. Remember, Michael's here to prove his innocence and his cooperation, and he's also wanting to inform us, the viewer. And what does he say? They would freak. But the messaging is unmistakable. Because ultimately, guys, the lie isn't that there's not going to be downsizing. No, downsizing is the lie. He doesn't want to worry them about the fact they have a murderer in the midst, right? Downsizing is the lie. He's not lying about people not getting downsized. The fact that everyone's talking about losing their jobs so much is a testament to how much Michael nails his objective in this episode. Downsizing is the lie. Nobody got downsized. Guys, they got killed. What this also shows us is Michael really does care for the well-being of his staff. Just think for a moment, guys, the load that Michael is carrying in this episode. And not just in this episode, for 9 seasons. I want you to think about that for a second. Michael is told by the police, we suspect you have a killer in your midst. This fact alone changes the entire series. Do you understand? This fact alone changes the dynamic between Michael and his staff. We then have a very interesting parallel between Michael and Dwight with the camera crew and the boom mic.
Do I need to speak up? Hello?
No, can you move it? Is that all right? Can you make that work?
That's fine.
Michael grabs the boom mic and brings it closer to himself. And I firmly believe this particular series of shots to be very symbolic. We know that Michael is being judged by how cooperative he is, right? So because the police have decided to tell him about the crime, he has to clear his name in a different way. So symbolically speaking, when the camera crew has come in, he grabs the mic and brings it to himself. You can interpret this as, I'm happy to speak. I'll tell you what you need to know. I am not worried that there's a camera crew here because I am not guilty. But then look at Dwight. The minute it comes into his peripheral vision, immediately he is on edge, right? Dwight is on edge because the day prior, he got rid of 2 of his competitors in the office. Then we also have the last word of the entire episode being Michael's.
I think better to be a happy idiot than someone who knows the truth.
Says it's better to be a happy idiot than somebody who knows the truth. Now, this actually has a double meaning. The first relates to our cover-up, because ultimately, remember, only one of the deaths is covered up. So what's going to end up happening at the end of this business day, Michael's convinced people that both of them got downsized, but some people are going to go home that evening, they're going to read the paper, turn on the television, and they're going to see that Tom killed himself. So from that perspective, it's better to be a happy idiot than someone who knows, and he's protecting the emotional well-being of his staff. That's the simple meaning. But the double meaning is this, guys. The double meaning pertains to the Scranton Strangler mystery. The happy idiot is the current Office fan. And I'd hate to say it, it's the Office fan who is still plugged into the Office matrix. The Office fan who thinks Pam and Jim have the dream relationship, for example. That's the happy idiot, right? But he sort of pauses and he doesn't want to give away too much information because had he said something like than a miserable, intelligent person, it would probably raise too many questions, right? So he says it's better to be a happy idiot than somebody who knows. And in this case, the miserable, intelligent people is those of us who have joined the Anti Strangling Task Force. Those of us who know that Pam is the office mattress and Jim has a gay affair with Darryl, right? This is the truth of the matter. It's really about the Scranton Strangler. Once you know the truth, this show takes a very dark turn very quickly. I mean, for those of you who are new to the channel, remember our real triple homicide picture in the Scranton Strangler newspaper? There's nothing funny about that. Andy comes into the hospital, he buys the spring paper, Cece's birth takes longer than expected, and he slaps the other paper on him. We're like, isn't that funny? But what about the picture? It's an actual murder. It's not that funny all of a sudden. It's better to be the happy idiot, some would say. So that's the meaning of that final sentence. It's very much loaded with a double meaning. Now, we are concluding this episode, but I didn't get to the discussion that Michael had with Kevin. We've sort of run over time here. So guys, please remember to subscribe because part 4 will be coming very soon.
If I can lie to them and it serves them, then that's what I'm going to do. What you don't know, well, it can hurt you, but if you don't know it won't hurt you, then you can just be happy for a little while, at least.